touched. Oh, here. Okay.
Oh, we're back.
Now we're back.
So you can apply. And if you're ready to do a PhD, the other thing to keep in mind is if you want to do a PhD, because a PhD is a much longer time commitment. There are more years involved. Thank you. And it usually, I mean, a master's can be a more flexible degree, and if you're not totally sure what you want to do, whereas a PhD usually prepares people to carry on in their fields. And if you want to go into the academy, you got to get a PhD. But if you're not sure, a master's can be a good place to start if you just want more studies in a particular field, but to keep your options open. Were there other questions about the sort of initial stage of things? Yeah, we got in the back, and then. So every time we close, Zoom shuts down.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Aziz Adiri. My question is on as we get pre-exams, probably a GT exam, ITH exams, and the like. Is it a must, or there are some exceptions to writing of exam, getting qualification, documentation generally before proceeding for admission or being admitted for PG program?
For the interventions to be making. Very quickly, most times when applying, we do see the requirement for writing samples. They do give probably 5 to 7 pages. And sometimes we advise to, send in our already published work. Now, this already published work most times exceed the required 5 to 7 pages. So in that aspect, what are we to do? Are we to, send an abridged version of a published work, or to stick to the guidelines from the, specific university that we are, interested in? Thank you.
Other questions on this sort of like early stage of the admissions process?
If I can interject here, there was a question in the chat about the sending cold emails to professors. You're supposed to have researched the professor, citing areas where your research interests align with theirs. However, most of these professors' works are not available. So how do we navigate the problem of accessing their works?
Sometimes organizations and questions you saw online.
All right, can I go? All right, thank you. I would like to know the exact structure of SOP. What statement of purpose is another very important selling point. Thank you.
So, do you all hear that question on statements of purpose? Do you all hear the question about statements of purpose? Yeah. I don't know if that meant. I don't know if they can. Hybrid panels are really fun.
I heard part of it, but not all of it. Can you hear me? I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, the sound was in and out for me, so I heard part of the question, but not all of it.
Professor Daniel, could you repeat the question?
So there was a few questions. There was a question, the right example that's too long. If you have a requirement, do you abridge it? Do you include the larger piece of which it was the part? There was a question about statements of purpose. What exactly is that? There was a question about testing and the tests that you need for admissions into graduate programs. And then when you guys came back on, we were discussing the MA versus PhD admissions question. I think we covered that.
Okay, Professor Placide, do you want to take any of those?
I'll take the right example, I guess. The page limit is really a guideline to ensure that what you submit I don't think that submitting a published piece of work that is longer is going to harm you in any way. That would be my answer to that. Anyone else?
I agree with that. I think that what we do is sometimes we say, our writing says 20 pages usually, and we say we're going to stop reading at 21. So, they're welcome to spend a long piece, we're not guaranteed to read it. So you just want to make sure that within that if they say 7 pages and you're submitting 20 pages, you should draw their attention to the 7 pages that you're really proud of. 7 pages that are really, really the best part. But it is like people need to see how that's a very short page, right? So we try to do it at 20 because 20 is not an article in history. So you can see how someone has developed an argument, use historiography, use sources. The question on testing, I will say the testing, it's dependent on the program. A lot of programs are phasing out the GRE. Some programs are phasing the GRE back in. So you kind of need to, I think the answer for a lot of these is there is no, unlike when you're applying for an undergraduate PA in the United States, where there's a common application, graduate school admissions is a very imperfect science in the art, in social sciences, and humanities. And it is very much departmental specific, oftentimes, what they want and what they require. And so testing, when we didn't require the GRE, then we did require the GRE. Now we don't require the GRE, and we might require the GRE again. So it kind of, yeah, you're welcome. So it kind of depends on our mood, I guess. I don't know. One thing you should understand, even for countries like the ultimate decisions for graduate admissions, at least at the universities I know, it goes, the department decides who they like, they submit that list to the graduate school, who often makes the ultimate decision and has veto power. And graduate schools often aren't going to know the fields as well as the departments. So sometimes they go under requirements. So you also want to check the graduate school website to make sure that you're getting those requirements. One of them, for example, is the English requirement. For English Nigeria, it's not a kind of test that you should have to take, and I don't know if it is, but in some countries, I know we had issues with a Ghanaian student who had to submit a TOEFL, even though he didn't speak English his whole life. So this kind of that requirement is something, again, that should be available on the department website. If it's not, it'll be available on the graduate school website. And so you're going to make sure that you're looking at both of those sites that know that you're getting the current requirements for each, because they do change. After COVID, a lot of things changed, but now things are maybe going back to what they were before COVID, and testing is part of that. And then there was another statements of purpose, same answer, unfortunately. What we require of a statement of purpose is very different than what other schools require. So it is like, I would always ask someone, if you don't know, ask a graduate student, ask the department, the graduate administrator for it. One thing that I should note is that a statement of purpose and writing sample are different. So in your writing sample, you don't need to waste any time talking about the project you want to complete. Because your writing sample is its own, and the statement of purpose is its own other thing. And describes the academic you want to be through the process of practice. Does that answer your question? But again, check the requirements on the different ones. I think you should back up. Yeah.
Great. I think we got through the questions that came from the house. One thing we haven't really touched upon at all, and that is so crucial, is different institutions talking about the funding in North America, in the U.S. I'm not sure the situation in Canada, but I've worked at all public universities, so this is a big distinction versus private. So I've University of Washington, that's a public university. Professor Magaziner is at Yale, it's a private university, and the funding landscape between those two categories tends to be quite different. Professor Placide, do you want to, we'll do a round and you can start us this time talking about the funding landscape.
Yeah, I actually prepared a visual on just that. So I think if that's okay with everyone, I'll just present it. It's just one short piece. Because among the things I think you must think about when you're selecting an institution is how you're gonna afford. I don't know if the room can see. I hope you all can see what I'm projecting. Yes, can you nod if you can see? Yes. Okay, right. So the costs, of course, include tuition and fees and I work in a public institution, and I'll be really honest with you, I never really understand what those additional fees are, but they exist, right? Supplies, and then of course living, which is where the costs really tend to add up. So for graduate programs at our institution, there are different sources of funding. There are assistantships, which are types of, essentially, they usually cover a portion of the tuition. And for students paying out-of-state fees, which would include international students, they often also waive the out-of-state portion and leave a smaller amount for which the student is responsible. Not small, but smaller. The assistantship also comes with a stipend. And the stipend is to earn the stipend, the student must work. So it's usually the student would work as a teaching assistant or a graduate assistant or a research assistant, depending on the specific assignment. A teaching assistant helps a professor teach somewhere or other. Research assistant assignment would be research related. A graduate assistant could do anything, office related, help a professor. Our assistantships are, we don't have a lot of money where it comes to assistantships, right? So there's one thing to think about is like how many assistantships might be offered, how competitive are they, and how much money is actually offered to the student in stipends. Bearing in mind whatever you might know about the cost of living in the location. So for example, where I am, South Florida, life is expensive, right? So I'm not trying to turn you off. I'm just trying to get you to think about what to expect, right? Life is expensive. The cost of living is high. Housing costs are high. Food's expensive for anyone, but certainly for graduate students. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so beyond the assistantship, there's a fellowship or scholarship, usually a special awards that are highly competitive. They're based on merit. So we'll look for things like really high GPA or something that makes a student stand out beyond other students. Not always available to international students. So you'd have to look at the site in the university, the website, to see whether there's any likelihood that as an international student you would qualify. But usually they're reserved, for U.S. citizens or permanent resident aliens. Loans exist. There are lots of those, but for international students, not federally funded loans, usually private loans. And we all know we try to avoid loans if we can, but I just wanted you to know that they exist. And I will not, of course, review all the different funding possibilities here, but I wanted to show you what you can do. And when you go to a university's website, there you want to see what different kinds of funding exist. And in our institution, we do provide, in our graduate school does provide information about graduate assistantships, the fellowships, and other types of funding outside of the university. And they also tend to, and I don't have a link right there, but they also tend to provide information about costs as well, so that the applicant can try to gauge beyond how much is it gonna cost if I were to receive an assistantship that waives tuition but leaves some fees and leaves me wondering how I'm gonna pay for living, right? So they estimate how much what the cost of living might be. I always say, whatever the institution tells you, if the institution suggests that food will cost you $1,000 for the semester, add about $500 more, right? Add at least $500 more or more. So plan for it to cost more than is suggested. So that's where I'll stop my piece.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. And since I've also been at public universities, one thing I would say about the University of California that always made admitting international students really tricky. So public means that the University of California gets funding from the state of California. So there's a preference for California-based students because they get in-state tuition, which costs the department less money. If someone applies who's, say, resident of New York and comes to the University of California, they pay out of state. The department has to pay out-of-state tuition for a year, and then they can become residents of the state of California, and their tuition goes down. What's really tricky with international students is that the department is needing to pay the full cost of full tuition the entire time they're there. So that meant when we were doing admissions with international students, we had to really look for people who would be very competitive for the highest funding packages that were competitive across the entire Berkeley campus. So that's just like ins and outs. One thing I would say is often there's a staff person who is in charge of graduate students, and this level of question is a perfect thing to field with that person. You might even be able to do a Zoom with them and find out a lot of this kind of backstage information. Just to pivot here, since we've talked about a public university in the US, maybe pivot to Daniel Magaziner to talk about the funding landscape at a private institutions, so at Yale.
So the funding at a private school, so in the US there's a number of private institutions that do graduate training, and the funding at a private school looks a little bit different. Basically, students at Yale and comparable schools are admitted fully funded, but what does that mean? As we talked about a little bit earlier, for 5 or 6 years, depending on the program. And what this means is that the university you won't have to pay any tuition, and you will get a stipend from the university that will help you defray your living costs while there. But what this does mean is that there are certain jobs that are required of you while doing research. So the first 2 years of funding are for coursework. So you're doing your coursework, you're earning what would be that terminal MA degree for you to leave the program without a PhD. But then usually the 3rd and 4th years, you pay for it with teaching work, with assistantship, as Sharon mentioned. And so teaching assistants help to supplement the educational staff at the university, a very familiar concept. And so you will be a teaching assistant working with a professor in a lecture course or some other capacity. And you will do that a number of times. And that's how your funding remains the same, but the way that you earn it is accounted for differently. Then in other programs, they might have a year where they pay you to go and do your research, a year of research, and then a year of writing, during which you might teach again, or some universities will offer money to help support that final year of completing dissertation. It looks the same every year. The amount of money you get is the same every year, but it's always called different things because it is accounted for differently as you're progressing through the program. That is how most of the Ivy League schools do it. That's how most of the Ivies structure their funding. With international students, it's sometimes a little bit different than national students than Americans, because Americans, especially Americans who are researching internationally, can access Fulbright scholarships that international students can't. And so sometimes there's other scholarships available to help international students to supplement the university funds so they can do a 3-year research. So again, depending on your field, some fields don't require that, many fields do, and to make sure that you have access to that. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Professor Adebayo, can you give us a view from where you sit about funding in terms of the funding landscape and among Canadian institutions?
I think, can people hear me?
Yes.
All right. I think that's the toughest question that I get to answer from the Canada side of things. And anyone who is familiar with the Canadian system already knows why this is a tough question for me. Almost all the good universities, in fact, almost all the excellent universities in Canada are public institutions. So it's unlike the US where you sort of flip the coin. In Canada, think of all the universities from the University of Toronto to McGill to York to McMaster. Just think of all of them. They're all public institutions. And Canada leans more towards Europe when it comes to funding allocation. For everything, Canadians come first. Canadian permanent residents and Canadians. So you have to be a Canadian, a Canadian permanent resident. And so also for funding for jobs, just think about everything. It's the same across board. Now, does that mean international students don't get in? Of course they do. But the implication is that the bar is already so high beginning. So in other words, international students get slots during our admission seasons. Most schools would offer one. My school offers 2 slots. I think 2 international AMAs, 2 international PhDs each year. And international means international. International means you're not a Canadian or a Canadian permanent resident. So if you're a US citizen, you're international. If you're European, you're international. If you're Indian, if you're Chinese, if you're Nigerian, so it makes the competition so tough that, and I often joke about this, if you're good enough to get into York as an international student, you can get into any top university in the US easily. That's the truth, really. It's not because York is like the biggest deal in the pile, but just because of the filter system in the Canadian system already makes it so tough and I have evidence of this. I mean, the few people that have come to York, they came because maybe they want to come to Canada itself, the attraction of Canada itself. Secondly, maybe they wanted to work with a particular professor, or maybe they're making a decision that favors their family, right? Because at the end of the day, they oftentimes let go of better financial packages in the US to come to Canada, really. Because it's if you're good enough to get into a Canadian institution, honestly, you're good enough to go to any top US school. And I'm not saying this because I'm in Canada, it's just the truth. Which is why if you're an extra layer on your pre-application process is to actually ask the faculty member that you're proposing to work with whether there is a chance of you getting in, a chance that beyond your academic excellence, but what are the chances of getting funding? And most of us are usually, at least from my experience, we usually straightforward in the polite Canadian way, but also straightforward by letting you know that, well, I think you have an excellent application dossier, but the funding landscape in Canada is tough, etc., etc. And in my case, in one case, I have actually had to it's possible that you might say, well, I think if you get there's been a candidate, yeah, so I can speak for someone. There's been a candidate that have actually told that, well, I hope you get an admission elsewhere this year, but if you don't and you want to try again next year, I'm going to try all my possible best, because this was someone that has an excellent profile. But I knew at that time that the chance of the person getting funding was really slim, not because the profile wasn't good enough, but because of the politics. So yes, so that's something extra that almost every grad student that you know that are in Canada can testify to this. Every faculty member, and if you're familiar with the Canadian system, it's unfortunately not something I can correct. It's unfortunately not something that you can do anything about. But just know that the funding landscape in Canada is really, really tough for international students. It's mostly like going to mainland Europe. It's like going to Germany or going to France and trying to get money from public funds, right? Which, if you're familiar with that landscape, you know that it's difficult if you don't have someone really, really advocating for you. So you really want, and I'm going to stop now, you really want a proposed advisor already advocating for you from the application process. And you can tell, obviously, you can tell whether someone is really interested in you based on the response to their email. And please don't misinterpret the response to the email. We tend to do that, and I'm speaking as a Nigerian now. If I say, oh, you've got an interest in research, you need to understand whether interesting means excellent or interesting means okay. Yeah. So you need to really read in between the lines, because sometimes I've had friends coming to me with excitement, and I read the email and I'm like, maybe you shouldn't be that excited, you know. So again, you really want your proposed advisor on your side from the application process if you want to want to be sure that you're going to get funding, because it's a funding question. But in this context, does the advisor even have enough interest in you to write all the letters to all the powers that be to say, I really want this person. This person should have one of these this year. That's what we do. Like and then if you really want that person, you go find someone else in the department that you can that can also sort of join you to write that letter to say, really want this person. This person is the best thing at the sliced bread. If you don't admit this person, the African Leadership Program will collapse. You know, like you have to I'm just exaggerating here, but the point is we've had to make strong cases for our international students, particularly the ones that we wanted in the past. So we've had to make strong cases. And you need to know from the application process whether your proposed advisor would be willing and able to make such a strong case for you as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And you've touched on something that's one of our prompt questions that I don't think we've addressed head on. So I'm going to propose we do a round of this of contacting prospective supervisors, the do's and don'ts of that. And I just want to highlight before we do a round of people addressing that, something that was come up. A number of people have talked about the value of contacting current graduate students. Like there's places where you can do your background, talking to current graduate students and also whoever is the staff person in charge. So you can do a lot of background work with them before you cycle up to contacting a professor. Professor Placide, would you like to elaborate more on do's and don'ts of contacting potential supervisors?
Yeah, sure. I think some of the points we raised before about familiarizing yourself as much as you can with the faculty who are in the department, their research, and if you have contacts who can tell you a bit about their personality will be really helpful here. But you want to, before contacting the individual, make sure that you know as much about that person's research or publications, any other kinds of involvement that individual has. And in writing to the individual to ask him or her to be your supervisor for your thesis or whatever, to be very specific or as specific as you can about your own research interest. So one don't would be, don't again be vague. Be honest though. So be honest. So if you are pretty sure you want to study, somebody just wrote about this in the question and answer. So I'm just gonna write that gender discrimination in the workplace and you have sort of a somewhat refined idea of where you'd like to go, but you're not quite sure, and you're hoping the individual will help you with that because of something the individual has done, then say that. To be as specific as you possibly can is one of the things that I would say. So don't go without information. Be respectful of the person's position and time. Show that you know what, to some degree, what you'd like to do, and that you know what that person has done, and you, that is the reason for which you're reaching out to that person. Let's see. That's what I'd say for now. Is anything that comes to mind?
Okay, excellent, excellent. And I should also say here that there are different cultures around admission with regard to this, whether or not you should have identified a supervisor at the point of application. Some admissions processes are very driven by, you know, Professor X sort of gets to champion one admit per year. When I taught at UC Berkeley, we didn't have that strategy at all with our graduate admissions. We were rather looking for people who were a good fit with the constellation of faculty. So we didn't want people trying to pick a supervisor on the front end. So just be aware of that. In networking with faculty, it's really about the conversation more than, you know, will you be my supervisor, or just thinking about the difference in those two lines of inquiry. Professor Magaziner, do you want to address this question of do's and don'ts of contacting professors?
Sure. Thank you. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this one. I'll try and keep it relatively short. The thing don't hesitate to reach out to people. Don't hesitate to contact people. People like to be contacted, and if they don't like to be contacted, they won't bring you back, and that's okay. But if there's someone whose work you're really interested in, and who you really would like to work with, you should reach out to them. But there are limits to it. I get a lot of emails from people that say, I want to work on the military history of late 15th century Southern Sudan, and your book, Black Consciousness in South Africa, 1968 to 1977, was very inspirational or influential in my projects. And that's obviously not true. So when you're reaching out to someone, I mean, it could be true, but it's really hard. You have to really bend your mind to make that make sense. So what you need to do is, when you reach out to someone, make sure in your own mind, before you send the email, why you're reaching out to that person. Is there stuff about that person and about that program that you're interested in connected with that is beyond just what a simple Google search and a list of the person's publications? Because people do get a lot of emails, and where you don't want your work yourself, your own application, to kind of get lost among so many emails. So in order to do that, you have to make careful decisions about who you email and how you present yourself. And so emails, I think, should not be exceptionally long. They don't need to be the entire history of your project. In chapter 1, I would do this. In chapter 2, I would do that. Chapter 3, I would do this. I get a lot of emails like that too. I don't read those chapter descriptions. And you're not at a point where you should be offering chapter descriptions. What you want to say is, here are the things I'm interested in, and here's why you and your program are the right place for me. What do you think? Not will you be my advisor, not necessarily are you accepting students, because oftentimes it's not up to me, it's up to the department. And so the best case scenario is I can make a case to the department, look, this person's interests and mine really intersect, and I really think that we can work together well. And so at the beginning of that relationship, you want to give your correspondent information that's going to help them see the connection. And if there isn't a connection, if you're just applying because you've heard of the university and it seems like a place that maybe you want to go, so there's no one there with who really has your research interests, don't email them. Don't apply to that university. You're probably not going to get in. And if you were to get in, if there's no one there who shares your interests, you're probably not going to have a very good time. So you want to make sure that you're doing your due diligence, that you're doing your research before you reach out to people. But once you know that this is the person that you want to be in correspondence, reach out. Write them an email. Don't be over the top. Don't say, your work is the most important thing. Since whatever. Be honest. I'm interested in X. You're interested in X. Maybe we can hang out and learn about each other's work together. Start in that sort of way. Keep it on that level.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I should mention that sometimes people have standing office hours. So that's another way that you can say, is it possible that I can sign up for your office hours and do that via Zoom? So it isn't just via email is the only way. So I see we are just about 1 minute from the end of our session. And I think this is a good moment to draw this session to a close. And so I have a request of the audience that you thank our panelists by bringing your hands together and give them a round of applause. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us. Justin, it's been all very helpful. Nice meeting you, Catherine.